Terrestrials and Transits. My name is Megan. I'm happy that you're here. In Saturn and Neptune at 0 degrees of Aries, I said the patriarchy cracked. And every time Saturn and Neptune meet, the patriarchy cracks just a little bit. Well, this week, the sun walks into that crack. In February, we watched the patriarchy crack. Like I said, Saturn and Neptune met at 0 degrees of Aries for the first time in somewhere between 6,000 and 7,000 years. We mapped the pattern every 36 years since 1846, a structural moment where power had been protecting itself loses that protection. I said 1846, 1882, 1917, 1953, 1989, and 2026. We said, watch what gets exposed. The sun moves into the final degrees of Pisces this week and crosses into Aries on March 20th, walking directly into Neptune at 1 degrees and Saturn at 3 degrees. So in Hellenistic technique, the sun's transit over a conjunction activates the conjunction. The luminary brings it into visibility. What was cracked in February is now illuminated. And here is where the light is hitting. But first, welcome. If you don't know me, my name is Megan. I'm an astrology student. I am learning astrology, and as I learn, I want to share things. So I look for patterns and correlations and mythology and connections in history and feminism. And as I find them, then I share them with you. And so those of you who are here who resonate with this work, super happy that you're here. You can find out more information about me and donation-based readings at meganriley.eu. Okay, moving on. So the aristocracy of impunity. Let's start in Britain because, just a reminder, the world is not America, and this story is not an American story. On February 19th, 2026, the former Prince Andrew was arrested, the first arrest of a senior British royal in centuries. The Thames Valley Police detained him on suspicion of misconduct in public office, specifically that he shared confidential government trade documents with Jeffrey Epstein while serving as UK trade envoy in 2010. 4 days later, Peter Mandelson was arrested outside of his home. Former British ambassador to the United States, former EU trade commissioner, a man who called Epstein my best pal in an email exchange, arrested on the same charge, misconduct in public office. In Norway, former Prime Minister Thorbjørn Jagland has been charged with gross corruption following discourses that Epstein covered his expenses and those of his family on trips to Epstein's properties. Norway's Financial Crimes Unit opened the investigation after the DOJ released 3.5 million pages of documents under the Epstein Files Transparency Act. In France, former Culture Minister Jacques Lang resigned as president of the Arab World Institute in Paris after financial crimes prosecutors opened an investigation into suspected money laundering connected to a company he and Epstein's network set up jointly in the U.S. Virgin Islands. And in Slovakia, the National Security Advisor stepped down. The EU's anti-fraud unit opened its own investigation. At least 9 separate investigations are now active across 8 countries. In the United States, nothing. The Department of Justice has said there is no evidence of an incriminating client list warranting further prosecution. Attorney General Pam Bondi says the case remains open. Trump, whose name reportedly appears more than 1 million times in the unredacted files, says he has been totally exonerated. He called the former Prince Andrew's arrest a very sad thing. A Reuters poll found that 53% of Americans say the Epstein files have lowered their trust in political and business leaders. 69% believe powerful people in the U.S. are rarely held accountable for their actions. Virginia Woolf wrote in The Three Guineas in 1938 that the same men who run the wars, who sit on the boards, who hold the titles, are the same men who have always defined the conditions under which women exist. She was asking English women to fund the prevention of fascism, and her argument was that they should not, because the institutions they were being asked to protect were the same institutions that had excluded them. trafficked their labor, and organized their subordination. What she saw in 1938 is legible in 2026. The network that protected Epstein is the same network that runs trade policy, sits in the royal palaces, serves as cultural ambassadors, chairs peace institutes. Titles are different, but the architecture is identical. Saturn is the planet of hierarchies, of inherited authority, of the structures that decide who is above consequence. Neptune is the fog that makes those hierarchies feel natural, inevitable, even sacred. At 0 degrees of Aries, the conjunction asked what happens when the fog protecting these structures lifts. Europe is finally answering that question, and America is not. The sun crossing into Aries this week illuminates the gap between those two answers, and the gap is the story that we tell. So, the price of empire. Since March 4th, the Strait of Hormuz was closed. U.S. and Israel military options against Iran began February 28th. Iran retaliated. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps declared the strait closed and began attacking vessels attempting to transit. 10 attacks in the first 4 days. 5 crew members killed. Major shipping firms suspended operations. Tanker traffic dropped by the first 70% and then to near zero. Brent crude surged past $100 a barrel for the first time in 4 years, peaking at $126. Qatar halted LNG production entirely after military strikes on its facilities in Ras Laffan and Misarid. Kuwait declared force majeure. Saudi Arabia cut oil production by 20% after 2 offshore fields shut down. The International Energy Agency released 400 million barrels of emergency reserves. Japan, which gets 70% of its oil through the strait, began releasing strategic stockpiles. The IRGC stated this week that it would not allow a liter of oil through the strait. Expect oil at $200 per barrel. They changed this morning. Okay. The price of oil depends on regional security, and you are the main source of insecurity in the region. Meanwhile, Iran continued sending oil through the strait to China, at least 11.7 million barrels since the war began, all of it headed to Beijing. Analysts called this the biggest energy crisis since the 1970s oil embargo. What they are less frequently saying is that it was a choice. U.S. and Israel strikes on Iran began on February 28th, and the Strait of Hormuz did not close itself. Well, injection here. On March 15th, 2026, the strait is open to anyone except the U.S. and Israel. Audre Lorde wrote in Sister Outsider that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. I say that a lot, but that's exactly what's happening. The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. The energy infrastructure of empire is exactly those tools, a narrow waterway, 21 miles wide at its tightest point, through which 20% of the world's oil and nearly all of Qatar's LNG passes. The entire architecture of global energy dependence runs through that checkpoint, and the war is over who controls it. The humanitarian cost, paid in fuel prices in Europe, gas prices in California, cooking gas shortages in India, and LPG supply crisis across Asia is not a side effect, it is the mechanism. Neptune in Aries rules the myths that justify conquest, security, stability, freedom of navigation, the defense of democratic values. Saturn in Aries rules the force that enforces those myths. The sun, crossing into that conjunction this week, strips the mythology and leaves the machinery wide open. This is a war over an energy checkpoint. The fog lifted and it just got petty. On March 3rd, Texas held its primary elections. Dan Crenshaw, 4-term Republican congressman, Navy SEAL, Harvard educated, lost his seat by 15 points to Steve Toth, a far-right state legislator endorsed by Ted Cruz. Crenshaw was the only incumbent Republican in Texas running without Trump's endorsement. In the aftermath, Crenshaw named what cost him his seat, the telling the truth thing. is viewed as real crime among some voters. He said that he was defeated by people who, quote, have no allegiance to the truth. A billionaire donor named Robert Marling seeded a super PAC with $675,000, roughly 2/3 of all the anti-Crenshaw spending, bankrolling mailers and TV ads that filled the district for months. Crenshaw raised $1.5 million more than his opponent, and the money lost to the story. Neptune's fog is the image, the narrative, the performance of loyalty that replaces actual record. A man was removed not for doing what he did, but for telling the truth about what others did. Saturn's structure enforces the loyalty. The sun illuminates how this all works. And into that crack stepped James Tellerico. Tellerico is 36 years old, a Presbyterian seminarian, former teacher, born in Round Rock, Texas. He won the Democratic Senate primary on the same night, defeating incumbent Jasmine Crockett by 7 points. He is already being called a likely 2028 presidential candidate. Joe Rogan told him on air in 2025, "You need to run for president." Barack Obama has privately called him really talented. What distinguishes Tellerico is not his faith. Plenty of politicians invoke faith. What distinguishes him is that he uses the language of Christianity against Christian nationalism, naming it clearly what it is: the worship of power in the name of Christ. He has condemned Israel's atrocities in Gaza and called the war the moral test of our time. He ran against billionaire mega donors and their corrupt political system. By name and in primary, he won. He is a sun in Taurus, born May 17th, 1989, part of the Saturn-Uranus-Neptune conjunction in Capricorn generation. They were born into the last major structural dissolution, the fall of the Soviet system, the end of the Cold War order. They carry that knowledge of structural collapse in their physical bodies. They know what it looks like when something that seemed permanent becomes rubble overnight, because it did. The sun walking into 0 degrees Aries illuminates what's possible in the crack that already happened. The politician who tells the truth about power, who names the moral test, who refuses the fog. Whether Texas elects him in November is a separate question. That he won in primary in Texas, naming these things out loud, is itself evidence that that crack is real. It happened, and we can see it. And the world is not America. On March 9th, the United States tried to derail 70 years of global consensus on women's rights at the UN Commission on the Status of Women. The U.S. requested a recorded vote on the draft conclusions under this year's theme, ensuring and strengthening access to justice for all women and girls. The U.S. move failed. Member states resoundingly approved the agreed text without crushing the attempt. The world voted against the United States on women's rights. Just that sentence. The world voted against the United States on women's rights. UN Women issued a global alert. Women globally hold just 64% of the legal rights of men. In over half of the world's countries, rape is still not defined on the basis of consent. A girl can be forced to marry by national law in nearly 3 out of 4 countries. These are not projections or warnings. They are current legal structure. In South Korea, young women are organized a structural refusal. The 4B movement, no marriage, no dating, no sex, no childbearing, spread across Korean feminist circles in a global conversation. In the impeachment protests of recent years, young women, nicknamed the protesters with light sticks, became the majority of participants. They bought K-pop light sticks instead of traditional protest signs. They challenged the misogynistic language and authoritarian culture that had dominated protest spaces for decades. They brought new energy. They changed what protests look like. The 4B movement is structural refusal and is made embodied into the body. Adrienne Rich wrote of In Woman Born that motherhood as institution, as opposed to the experience of motherhood, has always served the system that requires women's reproductive compliance. Korea's young women are withdrawing their reproductive labor from that system. The birth rate in South Korea is among the lowest recorded in any country in modern history. The system is already feeling it. In Italy, the Meloni government unanimously passed a femicide law in November 2025 that delayed a consent-based rape law vote on the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. It was a demonstration of priorities, performance of feminist protection wrapped around the continued refusal of feminist infrastructure. Gloria Anzaldua named this territory in the borderlands the borderland between protected and owned, where the language of care functions as the mechanism of control. Italy is living in that borderland right now. In Iran, this week, 3.2 million people have been displaced since the conflict began on February 28th. Diplomats in Denmark and Australia have applied for asylum in their host countries. The regime is cracking from the inside and the outside simultaneously. The slogan that came out of Iran's earlier protest movements, Women, Life, Freedom, carries the exact shape of what Saturn and Neptune in Aries demands: embodied female authority, the right to exist, freedom from the structure organized around your subordination. The World March of Women's Declaration, March 8th, named this whole architecture the patriarchal, racist, colonialist, capitalist system pursues accumulation through war and militarization. In the Middle East, Iran, Venezuela, Gaza, Sudan, Western Sahara, and Sahel. Africa is not a place for extraction, the declaration reads. Africa is a place of resistance and dignity and transformative power. Bell Hooks wrote in Feminist Theory, From Margin to the Center, that the feminist movement fails every time it centers the pain of those already centered and treats the pain of those at the margins as secondary, as context, and as background. Gaza is not background. Sudan is not background. The Congo, where Rwanda has effectively annexed 2 provinces through rebel proxies, is not background. These are the places where the Saturn-Neptune structure of extraction and fog is most naked, where the cost is paid in bodies, and where the myth of a rules-based order has been most thoroughly exposed. The sun at 0 degrees of Aries does not illuminate only what is comfortable and pretty. It's the whole structure. The sun doesn't fix what it illuminates. In Hellenistic technique, the luminary activates and makes visible, not resolving, not making pretty, not lucky, illuminates. Valens writes in the anthology that the sun's transit over a significant configuration brings the matter into public view, into the light of witnesses. We are in the interval between the crack and the rebuild. Vesta is in Pisces right now, and in the Thema Mundi framework, Vesta carries the sacred flame, the devotion that belongs to no one, that cannot be owned or traded. In Pisces, that flame is diffused. It's oceanic, harder to locate, but impossible to extinguish. Ceres entered Taurus, the mother who burned the world to get her daughter back. Now, in the sign of embodied earth, demanding substance over symbol. The goddess asteroids are more than decorative. They map what the structure has always required women to surrender, and they map what women have always found ways to keep. Mercury stationing direct on March 20th, the same degree as the North Node. We did a whole episode on that. Mercury direct on the collective soul path. what was obscured in the retrograde is going to be available to be said out loud. What was processing in private is ready to move. The question the sun's transit asks is not whether the patriarchy is defeated. The question is, now that we can see the crack, what do we do with what we see? The former Prince Andrew arrested, prime minister charged with corruption, a former culture minister under investigation, the Strait of Hormuz closed to everyone else but the US and Israel, Texas primary won by a 36-year-old who named Gaza as the moral test of our time, and the UN voting against the US on women's rights. South Korean women refusing the system and the most material way available to them, and Iran is cracking from the inside. This is Saturn Neptune at 0 degrees. So now when the sun crosses, the structure is going to be visible and probably not pretty. The fog is gone. What has always been true is now legible. Virginia Giuffre held the truth for decades. The fog held, and then it didn't. So that's exactly the pattern. The fog holds until it finally clears. And when it breaks everywhere. I'm staying outside a marina and on the North Sea. And when the fog comes in, there's nothing, right? You can't see nothing. I can see the red light and the green light for the entrance to the marina, for the entrance into the city. That's it. But when the fog clears, it clears. We are witnesses. We're here for this. We're here for this 0 degree. So at that moment when Aries crosses over, this is the 0 degree that we get to see all of the damage that happened, everything that is wrong. We get to see the crack, and we get to see how deep the cracks went. The beginning, the degree the patriarchal system claimed as this original point, is the degree where Saturn and Neptune just cracked it open. See you next time.